Hi, and welcome to our latest Lizzie Live episode of The Business of Writing a Book, Lighting the Way and Leaving Your Mark. And as they say, write what you know, because who better to expand on a subject matter than someone who's lived it with both innate and acquired experience and skills to pass on to others. And that's why I wrote my book, Destination Animation, How Smart Marketeers Convey Complex Messages Memorably, and apparently the first ever B2B book on animation, which is great. So the business of writing a book, Lighting the Way and Leaving Your Mark, is a LinkedIn Live series where I chat with authors who may be creatives, experts, or entrepreneurs generally to discover the inspiration behind the decision to write a book and how doing so helped to leave their mark in their respective fields and lead the way for others from a business, personal, or industry perspective. And today I'm super delighted to welcome Jackie Weaver, someone who has definitely left a mark and is going to talk to us about her new book, You Do Have the Authority Here, a witty and refreshing guidebook for Zoom etiquette, getting things done, and keeping your cool. Jackie took the internet by storm, becoming one of the most popular social media memes in February 2021 after going viral with the Handforth Parish Council's heated Zoom meeting, showing her booting out two troublesome council members and being famously told, "You have no authority here." So your book has been described as for every woman who's endured the "I know what's best for you." And if you're tired of being patronized, talked over, told to read the standing orders or the equivalent in your role, this feminist political icon shares her own standing orders for life. And hitting the news again this March, actually, it was revealed, Jackie, that the investigation into your parish meeting has cost the Cheshire East Council more than £85,000, and that you were not acting in an official capacity and did not have the authority, but it was understandable why you acted the way you did. Headlines that you handled with grace and humour, as always. And yeah, you now host your own chart-topping podcast called Jackie Weaver Has the Authority, and you've hosted a wide number of guests, including Jack Whitehall, Anton de Beek, and Jeremy Vine. So welcome to today's show, Jackie. It's lovely to have you on board.
Thank you. I listened to that fabulous introduction. I thought, that's a really interesting person.
Well, you are. You're amazing. You're an icon. So what made you write the book in the first place? You know, what inspired you? I mean, obviously circumstance and everything else, but tell us a little bit more about your book and what sort of took you there.
Well, between you and I kind of feel a bit of a fraud over this. I was at the Deepings Literary Festival a couple of weekends ago, and it was fascinating to listen to people whose real passion has been writing a book, and listening to the energy, the soul, the heart that they put into their writing, and I kind of just felt, I think maybe I'm in the wrong room, because for me it was incredibly easy, and I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate, is that with that media attention actually comes a lot of there's a lot of challenges come with it, but there are also a lot of rewards, and one of them was the publisher approached me. I don't think I'd ever thought of writing a book in my life.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Apart from anything else, I kind of, I think a lot of us feel that we have perhaps a message, a short message that we feel is important and we would like to share. But that's a shed load different from writing a book.
Right.
Which means you can't just extrapolate on that one small message for 500 pages or something. You really have to build some content into it. So when the publisher approached me and said, "Would you like to write a book?" my first thought was, no, I really wouldn't like to write a book. Because again, my thoughts about writing a book were about something that would take literally years. And would overtake my life. And at that moment, I was so busy, I didn't feel I could do it justice. But publishers can be incredibly persuasive and persistent. So they offered me help, so I wouldn't have to do it from beginning to end myself. A lot of the content is, of course, mine. A lot of the content is actually written by me. But what they gave me a lot of help with was actually the design of it. I would never have come up with that myself. And actually, it did for me what I couldn't have imagined doing and was really pleased with the results from. So it's kind of that having a small idea and having the support from people who understand what they're doing to make it into something that's much more accessible. I hope that's making sense. So I guess for me, then the question is, what do you want to write about? And I thought, well, listening to your introduction, I've heard that. I don't mean I've heard your introduction before, but I've heard some of what you said, about write about something that write about your lived experience. So I thought, well, my lived experience is largely town and parish councils, but I'm kind of thinking we probably want to sell more than 7 copies. Because it's just not going to be something that people, would think, I really need a book about that, And any books that are written about town and parish councils tend to be operational manuals, rather than something really accessible. So I thought about it a bit longer, and I had one of those moments, when you're kind of getting into bed at night. My husband and I have been married for 37 years, so you have that kind of almost like Walton-esque moment when you kind of share something from the day just before you go to sleep. And often Stuart and I have the same kind of thoughts about something that happened during the day, and we're saying, but it's just bleeding common sense. Why don't they see it? It's obvious. And I thought that's what I'd like to write a book about, common sense. Now, the publisher, again, thought the title was much more catchy, and I'm sure they are absolutely correct. If I'd named it, I would have called it A Little Book of Common Sense.
Oh, I like that
title. I kind of feel that's what it is.
Yeah.
Often when people ask me about my book, they then follow it up with, so what advice would you give to so-and-so? And my answer is always, I wouldn't give anybody advice for 2 reasons. One, I'm not sure I understand their life well enough to give them advice. And 2, nobody ever listens to advice. I think all you can do is kind of share something along the lines of, I found this worked for me.
Yeah.
If it has some resonance with you, I don't mind if you take it on board. But I try not to give advice. It's so easy to slip into it and say, oh, what you need to do is this. But actually what you're saying is...
Your book is a little bit of a guidebook as well, though, isn't it? I mean, it covers various topics. It covers, obviously Zoom etiquette, asserting yourself in the workplace, making change in your local community. I like that. And then dealing with tiresome men who go on and on. I mean... what wonderful topics to cover. But it's interesting that you say that it's kind of like the common sense side of things that that you touch on, and it's that makes you even more approachable, I think, as somebody to read, because we could always do with a bit of common sense, because sometimes we kind of get lost in our own thinking or the way that we do things. But I think these are wonderful topics to cover.
I think when you say about how we get lost in things, I mean, one of the things for me that I find, I don't know, maybe offensive is too strong a word, but I'll go with it. It is how much we are governed by what we hear in the media. I was very mindful of when I was asked to open the Brits. And first of all, before they'd asked me, I had no idea what they were. And then having agreed to it, I thought, well, I better at least watch them to see what it's all about. Anyway, wow. And what struck me as really odd about it was how many women, which was great, had received awards that year. That was 2021. And how many of them talked about female empowerment and how few clothes they wore. And I was just thinking, could we not have the same amount of female empowerment while wearing clothes? Does this just not work? Yes. And that kind of led me on to this kind of view I have, which is that we are constantly bombarding, usually but not exclusively women, usually but not exclusively young people, about how you can be perfect, how you can have it all, how as I say, perfection is achievable in every aspect of your life. And the more we push that, the more we're actually setting young people up to fail.
Mm,
Because the reality is, and again, that's kind of where I keep coming back to in the book, the reality is you can't. But it's like a very unpopular thing to say. It's a kind of like an almost anti-feminist thing to say.
mm,
But you absolutely can't be the perfect girlfriend, wife, mother, employee. It is not possible. You are going to have to prioritize one or more of those at one or more different times.
exactly, and the priority changes as
It
your sort of
does.
life
It
journey
does.
changes as well. I totally hear that. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think quite often we're rolled for our own backs, aren't we, by trying to do everything. But you're quite right. We're getting told that we can do everything. But that goes for young men and women, to be
Yeah.
fair. I think they have so much opportunity. It's that opportunity, knowing they've got that opportunity, and then worrying that they're not making the most of it, and then feeling a failure because of it, because it sort of like days in the in the headlights kind of thing. I agree. I think young people have got a lot of things that they told they can do, and feel that they feel like they need to do them all. And what a welcome book yours is then, if it highlights that actually you don't have to be brilliant at everything, and certainly not all at the same time.
And in fact, so different from certainly my generation growing up, where actually the opposite was what was being told to you all the time. You can't do that. And I don't. I mean, maybe I'm out of sync here with the rest of the world, but it kind of seems to me that that's almost a more positive message. Because certainly for many people, and I know it's not a universal point, for many people, make them do is challenge it.
Mm, mm,
Yes, I can do that. Who are you to tell me I can't do it? I can. But I think that's a more positive way of being than constantly being told that you can be, you should be perfection, and
mm.
feeling that you're not quite.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a very refreshing perspective. And you're right. I think in my generation as well, was told all the things I couldn't do. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember the careers advice at school was, I think I had two job potential career paths, and neither of which I wanted to follow. So, it's I think it's gone from, to ridiculous format now. There's too much choice, as you mentioned. So yeah, it's a credit. Your book is pithy, and it's quite concise as well. So it's an easy read, but lots of really good stuff in there. I mean, how did you settle on the message of the book? You mentioned that the publishers helped with the titling and the approach, but did you pick all the sort of, for example, like the Zoom etiquette and the how to deal with tiresome men and stuff? Did you pick out those elements as something that resonated with you, with your experience, that you wanted to share your sort of tips and tricks?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that there is an element of commercialization in it. Of course, there is. I mean, a publisher doesn't approach you to write a book philanthropically. That they see a marketing opportunity. And so some of it is really around that meeting, and kind of naturally falls from it, because actually there's lots of things there, quite therapeutic writing it in that respect.
Oh
There's
yeah.
lots of things that I just took for granted that this is what people do. It kind of, the idea of dealing with difficult people, that's my job. I
Right.
deal with difficult people. And I assumed, and I know this sounds so silly, but I kind of assumed that everybody else had the same coping mechanisms as I do.
Right. Do you want to share
We've
some of
never
those on
discussed
here?
them.
Yeah.
No, you have to buy the book.
Love it.
No, but seriously, it is things like, I guess for me, an important one is pick your battles. And in fact, a colleague of mine rang me on Friday night. Something had happened at work and needed a download, and said, "I can hear your voice in my head, and it is comforting." So I
Cool.
thought that was lovely. Yeah, I was really
That's
pleased
lovely
with that.
feedback. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's
and
really
it
cool.
was about things like pick your battle. Because if this is, I mean, everything is not hugely important. It's one of the
No.
things that I say in the book, particularly about getting your point across in meeting, because often these things overlap, is that, if you have 15 items on the agenda and you are passionate about every one, by the time we get to 5, people are not listening to you. They
Mm.
just think, here she goes again.
Mm.
you know, because you are not passionate about 15 items on that agenda.
Yeah.
So keep quiet on the things that other people perhaps have a passion for, let them have their space, and then take up the space talking about what's really important to you. And at that point, people will listen.
Okay.
The video that you saw, I had a fairly active part in that, as you saw. But actually, if you watch the next hour and a half of the meeting, you'll find I speak very little.
Right. Right.
Because my role in that meeting was making it happen.
Yeah.
And having got them up running, I can
Yeah.
then sit back and take a more supportive role. I don't need to contribute to every item on that agenda.
That makes sense. It's sage advice, of course.
Mm.
And have you found that writing a book has sort of opened up opportunities, business or personal, or just enlightened you to other things? You mentioned about getting asked to do introduce completely different shows and appearing on, guest. What was the thing? The Mastermind or something you were on?
Yeah, a celebrity mastermind.
Yes. What was that
There's
like?
such. I was going to say, first of all, there's such a long list of things that I've been involved in.
Really?
And I think,
Do
oh
tell.
God, yes. But and when I look back on it, it is so eclectic. That's kind of what surprises me, is that, and again, I'm going even back further than that. When the video went viral, I expected it to have interest among our sector, people who work in town and parish councils, stretch it out to local government generally. But the feedback I got was from all sorts of organisations, anywhere where there's a kind of hierarchy, whether it law practices, whether it be in schools with teachers, whether it be in universities. The list was just endless of people who spoke about similar experiences. So they kind of empathised or kind of relived that experience that they saw in their own field. So that it kind of became about them. So I started to hear from all sorts of different people, which was interesting and kind of depressing at the same time, because I'd kind of assumed that, over the last years, we'd made so much progress that actually when you saw something like that, it was almost a one-off incident. But that wasn't what I was hearing.
No, I think it's still endemic, isn't it? Sadly, but obviously the fact that you had such feedback from so many different industries shows that it struck a human chord, didn't it? I mean, it's really about sort of human relationships and how hierarchy, as you mentioned, and how those are dealt with. Amazing. It just shows it's a universal message. It's a universal problem, which you're addressing in the book, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think going back to that kind of human angle as well. Actually, it surprised me how often when I was writing there, because I didn't sit down and write it from beginning to end. I'd have a kind of like a chapter heading in my mind, and then when I had time, 15 minutes here and there, I'd write some more words about it. Not all got published, of course. Some of it got put in the bin, which I think was probably the right place for it. But a lot of it was, in fact, published. But what surprised me was how often I kind of related my own coping mechanisms to how I'd coped growing up as a child, which I hadn't expected. And actually, there's a lot in the book, far more than I kind of realised. Because I say, if you imagine I'm writing it bit by bit, so not writing it beginning to end. When it's fine, the chapters are finally put together as a first draft, I was surprised at how much of my childhood and my early life, particularly around my mother, came out. That really did surprise me. I knew it was an issue, how much of it hadn't been dealt with.
That's really enlightening, isn't it? It just shows that we are the product of our childhood, of our how we've been parented, how I suppose we've been taught to deal with issues, or not taught, had to teach ourselves that. That's fascinating, because I mean, how did you find the writing process? Obviously it's interesting that you've done it, sort of chapter heading by chapter heading. Was it something that you did daily? Was it a weekly thing? Was it and how long did it take you to get the first draft, let's say, together?
I'd say it took about 3 months.
Right.
But when you consider that I'm also kind of juggling media and working full time as well.
Gosh, yeah.
And it would be something that I would, don't get me wrong, I wasn't losing sleep over it, but I would kind of like think of something as I was dropping off to sleep at night, or something that I'd just written would remind me of something else that was long forgotten. So
Ah.
it was, yeah. So it
So
was,
it's all up here. It's just that
yeah.
teasing it out.
And as we were speaking, perhaps before we started recording, I'm very, I try very hard to live more in the moment.
Right.
It's very much a work in progress. And so writing the book actually gave me that opportunity to spend a little more time in those moments that I'd passed. Is that making sense?
Yeah. So you revisited past
Yeah,
experiences and then
yeah,
brought them to have bearing on what you were discussing in
yeah,
those particular chapters. That's really
yeah,
fascinating, actually. So it just shows how much of you as an individual comes out when you're writing, because there's so much stuff that's already there, content and material. It's just about putting it into the right format, I suppose,
yeah.
around an argument that you might be having or a topic that you want to talk through.
And that's so interesting because I, I come across this time and time again. I might going to do a training program for chairmanship for a local council. Yep.
Right. Yeah.
So my first thought is, this is only going to last 5 minutes. I've nothing to say. It's kind of like, what am I going to do? I literally have only got 5 minutes content here. And then you start and you put the first bullet point down on a slide. I don't like a lot of words on slides. I never do death by PowerPoint. I use it as a kind of way of taking me through the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that, the first bullet point goes down, and then you find actually there's quite a lot to say about that. And then that kind of leads you on to the second one. And then suddenly you're looking at, how am I going to edit this down because I've got so much?
Yes.
And the
That's
book
amazing.
kind of felt like that as well, because it felt like, well, here's the first 10 words. What else is there to say?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
actually, again, going back to that point about it being common sense and assuming that everybody thinks like you do.
Yeah.
And I am incredibly guilty of doing that. I assume everyone sees it like I do.
It is amazing. I think we grow up, especially when we're young, we always feel that our worldview is the world's worldview. But actually, as you get to know people and understand that everyone's their own bubble and they've got different worldviews. But obviously, your experience is so rich, and you've had, a plethora of different, scenarios, and that's obviously coming out when you're writing a book and or delivering a talk as the content that you naturally already have inside you, which is really fascinating. I mean, have you got any tips or anything for anyone looking to write a book, either personal side or business side, anything that can help encourage people to do it? Do you recommend that people do write a book, first of all?
I say it's not something I would ever have thought of doing for lots of reasons, and I'm sure this will resonate particularly with women around the imposter syndrome, is that I can't imagine why anybody would want to listen to what I've got to say. Because I think
beg to differ.
but that's how I feel. I can't imagine it. Yep. I think I lead a really, when I say dull life, I mean, I'm happy with it. But in terms of telling somebody else about it, I don't particularly enjoy going out and exploring places and doing stuff, etc. I live a lot inside my own head. And also for me, the most important things are those connections you make with individuals. So it's like when your brain connects with somebody else's brain, that's where I live. That's the part of life that I really enjoy. Not sightseeing, not traveling, not, that kind of thing. So I think it's first of all kind of understanding yourself a little better and giving yourself more credit than we ever do. And I think if you were ever thinking of writing a book, I think I'd start with, whoever your best friend is, And again, I suppose what I'm trying to do is recreate the publisher, because in that sense that the publisher became like the best friend, and the best friend that came and said, you have a story to tell.
Right.
Because I didn't believe I had a story to tell.
Oh, that's really good.
But just as an example of that bubble, something else just that I hadn't thought of for many years. I know the words to so many hymns. I mean, so many. I can't tell you how many. And the reason for it is, I didn't find it out at first, but when we had assembly at school, we had a flip chart with the words the hymn on. And the teacher used to say, well, you can't read them, come forward. So I came forward. I still couldn't see them. But everybody else seemed okay with it. So the next one, I moved a bit forward. And literally, I'm now standing, in front of the screen, and I still can't read it.
Oh, wow.
So I now just assume everybody else is the same. So I just learn them off by rote. Look at the board and, do that. And it wasn't until we were sitting in a cafe, and I don't know if you were there was a sign for milkshakes, but very brightly coloured milkshakes. There's a very bright, kind of sign. I remember saying to my mother, what's that? And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, but what's that coloured thing over there? I just, but we find out I am incredibly short-sighted.
Oh, my word.
Which means that I see colour very brightly.
Yes.
But I'd say incredibly short-sighted. And I must have been about 11 before it was spotted. I just learned things off by heart, and I assumed everybody else was the same.
Gosh, that's shocking. That's really shocking. You poor thing. That must have been so confusing and terrifying at the same time. But wow, that's quite a discovery to make, isn't it?
Yeah, oh. but you just assume everybody is the same. And I used to get headaches all the time. I used to sit and watch the telly literally 2 inches from the screen, kind of thing. But nobody twigged it, and I just assumed everybody else was exactly the same. Gosh, so I thought that was really quite interesting. But I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah, and I wonder how much we all do assuming things like that as well, just generally. But it brings me on to, so you mentioned about the meeting of minds and connecting with people. Do you connect with other authors, whether they be for entertainment or business? Do you find that there's a connection there when you read something, go, oh my God, that's exactly how I feel, or yes, that's how I think as well? Have you got any favorite authors, or is that something that resonates with you, or?
Not really. My passion for reading is horror stories and science fiction. And so
dark horse.
So my interest when I'm reading things like that is either in the world, when we're talking about post-apocalyptic, that kind of thing, or a murder or something like that, how it then affects the people around the situation. That's what I'm interested in.
Okay, that's really interesting, because so our art director is quite into apocalyptic stuff as well as a few of our other team members, and she has a whole plan, an escape plan if we have a zombie invasion, and the surprise that nobody else has. But again, assuming that everyone else should have a zombie
you need
plan.
You need to put her in touch with me. Okay. I have a plan. And oddly enough, if you listen to my podcast with Reverend Kate Botley,
right, I'm going to write that down.
She has a plan too. So it's not that weird. And my husband and I, that sounds very regal, doesn't it? But Stuart and I have literally discussed this periodically about, how, what we're going to do in the apocalypse.
Wow.
We have very different views, by the way. We have very different views.
This sounds like another book you should put together, people's views on their apocalyptic plan. Oh, that is amazing. Oh, fantastic. So have you got any other sort of tips or encouragement for people to think about writing their own book, or anything that you learned along the way with regards to either the writing of it, the what you may have learned about yourself, which you've already told us a little bit about, or any other sort of tips that you can share?
I think for me, one of the things that was unusual for my way of working generally is that you're probably guessing I'm quite a controlled person in lots of different ways, although it might not appear that way. And I don't like to start something unless I know where it's going.
Okay.
IMDb is wonderful. I don't know what it
Okay.
stands for, but it's that thing where if you're watching a film, you can look it up and find out how it ends.
Do you do that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my word. That's oh
I
gosh.
yeah, and if it's not on IMDb, then we find a different film because the stress of not knowing where this is going makes my head hurt.
That's so interesting. See, I personally, I love the journey, and I don't want
No,
to know up front anything. I want to be taken on the complete journey and have the sort of jump scares and the sort of whatever twists in the tail. That's
yeah,
fascinating. One
no.
thing that
And with
sorry.
a book, I have to read the end first. Yeah,
Wow.
need to know where it's going. So I kind of let's say just finishing that bit off. So the idea of kind of launching into writing a book with no idea where it's going was really surprising, but again, incredibly cathartic, enlightening, freeing almost. So in terms of advice, which I said I don't give,
Hmm.
for me, what I found worked was actually just putting something down on paper. And two things. I have two different ways of writing. When I've got a very firm idea in my head of where I want to go with something, I'll type it.
Okay.
And I'm a very good typist.
Right.
A very fast typist. I can type and talk about something different. So it's something I've perfected over many years.
Amazing.
But if I've got an emotional connection to it, then I write it longhand. Because
Ah.
the writing longhand for me, and I do have a passion for papers and pen. I collect all sorts of papers and books and things like that, and I love writing.
I'm a sucker for stationery as well,
Yeah.
I must say.
And the process of physically writing slows my brain down enough that I can really get hold of what it is I'm trying to say. Whereas when I'm typing really quickly in the background there, it's kind of almost like the keyboard is running away with me.
Oh, that's interesting. Do
And I
you
do a
find
mix of both.
do you find you're more creative in your handwritten stuff
Yes.
over as in creative thinking that rather than the
Yeah.
typing? Okay, that's really
So
interesting.
is that the handwritten stuff will be the map ultimately, and the typewritten stuff will be the supporting evidence.
Okay, I'm just writing here if there are any questions from our audience to put it into the comments here. So we'll give it a couple of seconds. But gosh, you've given us so much food for thought, and that's really, really unusual perspective as well. It's been delightful talking to you, and very eye opening. And thanks for being candid as well about sort of some of the things that you've picked up from your childhood. I can't believe that you weren't diagnosed, but I guess it's in those days as well. People were so busy doing other stuff. There wasn't a sort of reminders from the NHS to do things or letters from Boots or whatever. People just didn't have that kind of stuff. It was all down to very busy parents, I suppose, to remember to get their kids checked.
I think the other thing is that, and again, I guess this comes from my, I think I make mention of it in the book. I think it's one of the small pieces that I put in. I'm a Scot, although you wouldn't recognise it from the accent, but born and bred. We moved here when I moved to England when I was 10. And I remember going into a corner shop and asking for some sweets. And choosing the sweets and handing them to the lady, and asking for pork. And she'd no idea what I was talking about. And I couldn't think of any other word because they're called porks. That's what you put sweet in a pork. And in the end, we managed to get through the language barrier. I was talking about a paper bag, And sort of that solved that one. But at that point, I decided that I was going to talk like everybody else. That Scottish accent was going to be gone, and I think that was the point at which that kind of thing was sealed. So I would never say anything that made me stand out from anybody else. So if nobody else was complaining about not being able to read the board, neither was I.
Right. And do you have any siblings, Jackie? Do you have any siblings?
Young.
Oh,
I have a brother who is 3 years younger.
Oh, right. Okay. So you're the older sister. So
it's quite funny. My brother, so he paints. His thing is watercolor birds.
Wow.
And so that's what he does. But he finds it incredibly difficult to get inspiration to do it. On the other hand, I can see the pictures in my head, but have no ability to put them on paper. The fact that he did a degree in art probably helped him. I'm much harder on myself and just expect to be able to do it.
Yeah, it does take, what is it, 10,000 hours of practice to become a master at anything, isn't it? So
yeah, but I haven't got that much time. I want to do it now.
Fair enough. Well, I don't think we've got any questions yet, so we can always catch up at another time or send questions through. But thank you so much for being a guest, and I've really enjoyed having you on board. I love what you've written. I love the book. I love the whole story around Jackie Weaver, and long may you remain a feminist or female or just person icon that we all look up to and resonate with. I mean, that whole human to human thing, I think it's definitely something which is very on point in this current climate. So thank you very much. And
My pleasure.
Can everybody buy your book? Where's the best place to buy it?
Oh, well, you can, of course, like you can get everything else on the planet, get it from Amazon, or you could go to your local bookshop and pick one up there.
That would be fantastic. Well, thank you, Jackie. Thanks for coming, and have a lovely end of the week. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.